Alara had always thought dying would feel different than this. Not slower, not this specific kind of slow, where you had time to notice the shape of the man's hands as he tied the rope around your wrists, gentle almost, like he regretted it. Not this kind of slow, where you could count the beams in the ceiling of a stranger's bedroom and wonder if this was the last room you'd ever see. She was wrong, obviously. She wasn't dying. She was getting married. Some days those felt like the same thing. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had existed. 3 weeks earlier, Alara had been exactly where she'd always been knee-deep in the Millbrook, hauling in nets that came up lighter every season, listening to her father cough in a way that scared her more than he let on. The village of Adenfell wasn't dying. Not exactly. It was just running out of time to be anything else. 3 bad harvests, a sickness that had taken the Hendersons' youngest boy last winter, a debt to the crown that the elders spoke about only in whispers, like saying it too loud might make the collectors arrive sooner. And then, the letter came. Alara remembered exactly where she was standing when her father read it out loud at the town hall pressed against the back wall, half listening, more interested in whether Marisol had saved her a seat. Then, she heard the words royal decree, and her attention snapped forward like someone had pulled a string behind her spine. The terms were simple enough to understand and impossible enough to accept. Adenfell's debt would be forgiven. Protection would be extended. Grain would come before winter, this winter, enough to actually matter. All in exchange for one thing. A bride. Not for the king himself, nobody had been foolish enough to suggest that. For a lord in his service, some official whose name nobody in Adenfell had ever heard before that afternoon. A political marriage, the kind that happened in stories about kingdoms far grander than this half-forgotten fishing village. Except now it was happening here, to someone real, and everyone in that hall had gone very quiet, doing the math on which family had a daughter of marrying age and no better options. Alara had a mother who cried without meaning to, and a father whose hands shook now when he tried to mend nets. She had a younger sister, Wren, 17 and terrified and already being looked at by half the room like she was the obvious answer. Alara stood up before she'd decided to. "I'll go," she said. The room turned to look at her the way rooms do when someone says something they can't take back. Her mother had argued, of course, screamed a little, cried more. Her father hadn't said much at all, which somehow felt worse. Wren had grabbed her hand afterward and said, "You don't have to do this," and Alara had squeezed back and said, "Someone does. And it's not going to be you." It wasn't bravery, not really. It was arithmetic. Wren still had a chance at an ordinary life, a boy who liked her, a future that didn't involve leaving everything she knew. Alara had spent the last 2 years watching her father's hands shake and her mother's shoulders bend a little more every season, and she was tired, in a way that made this decision feel less like sacrifice and more like relief. She told herself that on the ride out of Adenfell, 3 days into a journey that felt like it was swallowing her whole. She told herself that again now, standing in a stranger's chamber, wrists loosely tied for a ceremonial binding rite nobody had bothered to explain to her, waiting for a man she had never met to walk through that door and become her husband. The attendant, a stiff, unsmiling woman named Greta, had told her almost nothing. Only that her betrothed was called Lord Corwin, that he served the crown in some capacity nobody would specify, and that Alara should be grateful, considering what? Alara hadn't asked. She'd learned quickly that questions here got shorter answers than they deserved. She looked down at the rope around her wrists, soft blue silk, decorative more than functional, and thought about how strange it was that fear could feel this specific. Not the wide, formless terror of drowning or falling. Something smaller and sharper. The fear of a door opening. Footsteps in the corridor. Alara's spine went straight without her permission. The door opened, and it wasn't a stranger at all. Alara's breath left her in one sharp exhale, because she knew that face. knew the line of that jaw, the particular way his dark eyes moved over a room before settling, the small white scar through one eyebrow she'd noticed 3 days ago in a clearing 40 miles from here, and had not been able to stop thinking about since. The man from the woods. He stopped in the doorway, and something crossed his face to recognition, sharp and unmistakable, followed almost immediately by something that looked, absurdly, like guilt. "You," Alara said, before she could stop herself. It came out more accusation than greeting. "Alara," he said her name like he'd been carrying it around for 3 days, turning it over. "You're Lord Corwin?" The words felt wrong in her mouth. "You're the man I'm supposed to," she stopped. Because that wasn't quite right either. Something in the careful, controlled way he stood there, the way even his attendants outside had gone silent and rigid at his approach, told her Lord Corwin wasn't the whole truth. "Not exactly," he said quietly, and closed the door behind him. 3 days ago, Alara hadn't known his name at all. She'd stopped at a stream to refill her water skin, exhausted from 2 days of travel with an escort who spoke to her only in clipped, necessary sentences. The forest had been quiet. The kind of quiet that made a person feel very small and very far from home, and she'd sat on a flat rock and let herself cry for exactly as long as she'd allotted herself 5 minutes. No more, because crying past that point felt like giving up. She hadn't heard him approach. "That water's cleaner upstream," he'd said, and Alara had nearly fallen into the stream from the shock of it. He'd been sitting on a fallen log, close enough that she should have noticed him, dressed like a hunter or a soldier off-duty plain leather. No crest, no signs of rank. Tall in a way that made the log look smaller than it was. Dark hair pushed back like he'd run a hand through it recently, and eyes that watched her like he was cataloging something, carefully, without letting her see the conclusion he was reaching. "You could have said something before I embarrassed myself," she'd said, wiping her face with the back of her hand, too tired to be properly mortified. "I didn't want to interrupt." A pause. "You looked like you needed it." Needed to cry in front of a stranger? Needed to cry. Period. The stranger part was unfortunate timing. Something in his mouth had almost curved into a smile. Almost she should have been afraid. A woman alone in the woods, a man she'd never met, days from anyone who'd notice if she disappeared. But there had been something in the stillness of him, something careful, that made fear feel like the wrong response. "I'm getting married," she'd told him, for reasons she still didn't fully understand. Maybe because he was a stranger, and strangers were safe in the specific way that people who'd never see you again were safe. "To a man I've never met." "In 3 days. That sounds unpleasant. It's fine." She'd said it too fast. "It's for my village. It matters more than whether I like him." He'd tilted his head, studying her in that unhurried way again. "Does it have to be one or the other?" "What?" "Mattering for your village." Liking him. He'd shrugged, one shoulder, like the question cost him nothing to ask and everything to actually mean. Seems like a strange thing to assume, that they're opposites. Alara hadn't had an answer for that. She still didn't. 3 days later, standing in front of him with silk rope loose around her wrists. They'd talked for almost an hour by that stream. He'd asked about Adenfell, and she'd found herself telling him more than she meant to her father's hands. The debt, the sickness that had taken the Henderson boy, the particular grief of watching a place you loved slowly run out of options. He'd listened in a way that felt unfamiliar, like her words were actually landing somewhere instead of passing through. She'd asked his name eventually. He'd hesitated. She remembered that hesitation now with new understanding, and said, "KL," which she now suspected was true in the way a nickname is true, a piece of something larger left deliberately incomplete. "You don't look like someone who spends much time crying by streams," she'd told him, trying for lightness. "I don't spend much time doing anything that isn't required of me," he'd said, and there had been something underneath that sentence she hadn't understood then. She understood it better now, looking at him standing in this doorway with the weight of a title she hadn't known he carried. "You should go," he'd said eventually, glancing at the fading light. "Your escort will worry. Will I see you again?" "Maybe," he'd stood, and for a moment looked like he wanted to say something else, something that didn't make it out. "Good luck, Alara, with the wedding." She'd walked back to her escort's camp with her chest feeling strange and full in a way she didn't have a name for, and she'd thought about him for 3 days straight, annoyed at herself the whole time for how much space he was taking up in her head when she was about to become someone else's wife. Now, he was standing in front of her in robes too fine for a hunter, and the pieces were rearranging themselves with sickening speed. "You're not Lord Corwin," she said again, quieter this time. "Corwin is my steward," he said. He handled the arrangements. The name on the contract, that was he exhaled, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. "It was easier that way. I wasn't sure how else to meet you without every part of this becoming about my title before it could become about anything else. And what is your title?" He held her gaze, and something in his posture, the way he seemed to brace for her reaction, told her the answer before he said it. "I'm the Alpha King," he said. "Kyle Ashgrave, the man you're supposed to marry today, and 3 days ago, in those woods, I already knew exactly who you were, and I let you talk to me like I was nobody." Alara's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in the kingdom, the one whose name made the elders in Adenfell lower their voices, whose reputation had reached even their little fishing village in fragments, ruthless in war, untouchable, unmarried despite a decade of pressure from every noble house with an eligible daughter. And she'd told him about her father's hands. She'd cried in front of him. Why? She managed. Why lie? "Because every woman who's ever stood in front of me has seen the crown first," he said. "Low, careful. I wanted 3 days where someone saw me instead." He didn't move closer. That was the first thing Alara noticed, that for a man who apparently held enormous power, he stood very still, like he understood exactly how much space he was taking up in her fear and was trying not to take more of it. "You could have told me," she said. "At any point in 3 days." "I could have." He didn't try to defend it. "I told myself I was protecting the arrangement, making sure you didn't perform gratitude at me the way everyone else does." "But that's not entirely true either." "Then what's true?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I liked being someone you talked to honestly," he said finally. "I've had very few of those conversations in my life. I wasn't ready to lose it yet." Alara looked down at the silk rope around her wrists, the ceremonial binding she still didn't fully understand, and felt something complicated rise in her chest. Anger. Yes, but tangled with something gentler that made the anger harder to hold on to cleanly. "I'm still marrying a stranger," she said. "I just know his face now." "Is that worse?" "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly, like that was a fair answer, maybe the only honest one available to her. Then, he crossed the room not quickly, giving her every chance to step back if she wanted to, and reached for the rope at her wrists. "This isn't required," he said, undoing the knot with careful fingers. "The binding rite is symbolic. I won't force a beginning built on something you didn't choose to wear." The rope fell away. Alara rubbed her wrist, more out of habit than actual discomfort, and watched him step back to a respectful distance, giving her room to breathe. "Why does the ceremony even need me at all?" she asked. "If you're the king, surely you could have any woman in the kingdom. Political alliance, wealth, whatever this is supposed to be for." Something shifted in his face, not quite pain, but adjacent to it. "There's a pact," he said, "older than my father's reign, a binding between the crown and a handful of border villages, Adenfell included, going back generations. In exchange for protection and support in hard years, one of those villages provides a bride when the crown requires it." He paused. It's an old system, an unfair one. I've been trying to dissolve it for 2 years and the council won't allow it, not without triggering a dozen other agreements I don't have the leverage to unwind yet. So, I'm a debt payment. You're the thing I've been trying to avoid asking anyone to be, he said, and the honesty in it landed harder than she expected. The council chose Adenfell for this cycle. I didn't choose you specifically, Alara. I want to be truthful about that even if it's not comfortable to hear. But you knew, in the woods, you knew I was the one coming. I did. And you still let me talk to you like a stranger. Let me not know I was talking to the man deciding my entire future. Yes, no defense in it, no softening. It was selfish. I understood that even while I was doing it. Alara turned away from him, walked to the narrow window, looked out at a courtyard she didn't recognize, in a castle attached to a life she hadn't asked for and couldn't undo now even if she wanted to. Adenfell needed this. Her father needed this. Ren needed this. None of that had changed in the last 10 minutes, no matter how much the ground had shifted beneath everything else. What happens if I refuse? She asked, quiet. The pact allows either party to decline before the binding is finalized. He said it like it cost him something. If you decline, Adenfell loses the current agreement, but I would personally see to the debt forgiveness regardless. You would not be punishing your village by choosing not to marry me. She turned back to look at him, surprised. You'd do that, even if I said no? I'm not interested in a wife who stays because the alternative is her family's ruin, he said. If that's the only reason you're standing here, I'd rather send you home and find another solution for Adenfell myself. It should have made the decision easier. Instead, it made it harder, because it removed the one clean, simple reason she'd been holding on to for 3 days that this was sacrifice, that this was arithmetic, that liking or not liking him was irrelevant. Now it was relevant. Now it was the only thing that mattered. Ask me again, she said. Properly, not as the crown. As Kale. Something moved across his face, surprise, then something warmer underneath it. He knelt, not fully, not a formal proposal, just enough to bring his eyes level with hers, and there was nothing careful in his expression anymore, nothing measured. Alara of Adenfell, he said, would you marry me? Not the pact, not the debt. Me, she should have needed more time to answer. That was what she told herself later, lying awake in a bed too large and too soft for someone who'd spent her whole life sleeping on a straw mattress that creaked. She should have needed days, weeks, some proper interval to weigh the decision the way a decision this size deserved to be weighed. Instead, she'd said yes almost before he'd finished the sentence, and neither of them had commented on how fast it came. The wedding itself happened that same afternoon, smaller and stranger than anything Alara had imagined during the 3 days of dreading it. No grand cathedral, no 1,000 watching nobles. Kael had insisted on something private. Just a handful of witnesses and an old priest who performed the rites with the bored efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times for 100 different couples who didn't particularly want to be there. Except this time, standing beside him, Alara found she did want to be there. That realization terrified her more than the wedding itself. You're allowed to look less like you're facing an execution, Kael murmured during a lull in the ceremony, and she'd nearly laughed out loud, which earned her a sharp look from the priest and a poorly disguised smile from Kael that made the whole absurd afternoon feel suddenly bearable. Afterward came the part nobody had warned her about the court. Alara had known, abstractly, that marrying a king meant becoming visible to an entire world of people who'd spent their lives around wealth and power, but she hadn't understood what that visibility would actually feel like until she was standing in a hall full of nobles who looked at her like she was a puzzle they were trying. Politely, to solve. The fisherman's daughter, someone murmured behind a raised fan, not quietly enough. How extraordinary. Alara kept her chin level and said nothing, though her hands wanted to curl into fists at her sides. Ignore them, Kael said, close enough that only she could hear. They'll find something else to whisper about within a week. Will they? No, he admitted, but I'll deal with it if it becomes a problem. One woman in particular seemed unable to stop watching Alara across the hall, tall, elegant in a way that looked practiced rather than natural, with pale gold hair arranged in a style that must have taken hours. Lady Sarah, Alara would learn later, daughter of one of the kingdom's oldest houses. The woman half the court had assumed would eventually become queen. Sarah's expression when their eyes met was not hostile exactly. It was something colder and more controlled than hostility, the look of someone recalculating a plan they'd spent years constructing. That's Lady Sarah, Kael said, following her gaze. Her family's held influence at court for 3 generations. She's not someone to underestimate, but she's not someone you need to fear either. She looks like she disagrees with that assessment. Kael's jaw tightened slightly. She had certain expectations, ones I never encouraged, whatever she may have told herself. I'll speak to her if it becomes necessary. It did become necessary, though not that night. That night, Alara was led to chambers so large they made her feel absurdly small, dressed in nightclothes finer than anything she'd owned in her life, and left alone with a husband she'd known properly for less than 4 days. You don't have to be nervous, Kael said, watching her from across the room with the careful stillness she was beginning to recognize as deliberate, a big man consciously making himself smaller, softer, safer. I'm not nervous, Alara said, which was a lie, and judging by his expression, not a convincing one. We don't have to do anything tonight you're not ready for, he said. The marriage is legally binding regardless. Nobody requires proof beyond the ceremony itself. She appreciated that more than she knew how to say. Appreciated, too, that when she finally crossed the room and sat beside him, he didn't reach for her first waited, patient in a way that felt like its own kind of gift, until she reached for him instead. They talked more than anything else that first night. About Adenfell, about the mother who cried without meaning to, about a childhood Kael described in careful edited fragments, a father who'd ruled through fear and expected the same of his son, a mother who died before Kael was old enough to remember her voice clearly, a decade of proving himself to a court that had never fully believed a soft heart could survive inside someone built like a weapon. Is that what you think you are? Alara asked. A weapon? It's what I've been told I am for most of my life, he said. I've stopped arguing with it. I don't think that's true, she said, and meant it, and something in his face shifted like he wanted, badly, to believe her. The weeks that followed settled into something Alara hadn't expected, not happiness exactly, not yet, but a kind of careful, growing comfort that surprised her more each day it continued. Kael was patient in ways his reputation had never suggested. He asked about Adenfell constantly, arranged for supplies to be sent ahead of the promised grain shipment. Listened when she worried about her father's hands and her mother's tired shoulders, like those worries mattered as much as any counsel matter on his desk. He was gentle with her in ways that felt deliberate, like a man handling something he was terrified of breaking. But there were other moments, where she caught glimpses of the Alpha King the court whispered about, the one whose name made grown soldiers straighten their spines. She witnessed it once during a council meeting she wasn't meant to attend, but had wandered into by accident. Watching a man twice her size go pale and stammering under the weight of Kael's controlled, quiet fury over a supply shortage that had cost lives at the border. You looked terrifying in there, she told him later, only half joking. I am terrifying, he said simply. I've spent years being terrifying on purpose. It's kept this kingdom stable in ways gentleness never could have. And with me? With you, I don't have to be anything except what I actually am. He'd said it like a confession, like it embarrassed him slightly to admit how much easier that felt. She believed him. Mostly, Lady Sarah remained a persistent, uncomfortable presence at court, never openly hostile, always technically correct in her behavior, but with a way of appearing at gatherings Alara attended, offering comments about proper etiquette or castle customs, delivered with just enough condescension to sting without ever crossing into something Alara could reasonably object to. "You held your fork incorrectly at dinner," Sarah told her once, in a tone dressed up as helpfulness. Small things matter more here than you might realize, coming from where you did. "Thank you for noticing," Alara said, refusing to give her the satisfaction of visible discomfort, though she practiced holding her fork correctly for 20 minutes alone in her chambers that night. Furious at herself for caring. "She's testing you," Kyle said when Alara mentioned it. "Looking for a crack she can widen. Don't give her one." "I'm trying not to. You're doing better than you think." He'd reached over and taken her hand, thumb moving over her knuckles in a way that had become familiar over the past weeks, comforting in a manner she hadn't expected to need, but had come to rely on regardless. Sarah has spent years believing this crown belonged to her eventually. It's going to take her time to accept that it never did. "Did you ever consider her? Before me?" "My counsel did. I never did." He said it plainly, without the diplomatic softening he usually applied to court matters. There's a difference between being suited to a position and being suited to a person. Sarah would have made an adequate queen. She would never have made me happy. And I do? He looked at her with an expression she hadn't yet learned the full shape of, something between wonder and disbelief, like he still hadn't fully processed his own luck. More than I know how to explain. It was during one of the quieter evenings, weeks into the marriage, that Alara finally worked up the courage to ask him something that had been sitting uneasily in her chest since the wedding. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Meeting me the way you did?" Lying, even for 3 days, Kyle considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the lie," he said, "not the meeting. If I'd come to you as the king from the start, you would have performed gratitude at me the way everyone else does. I would never have known what you actually thought, what you actually felt, before the crown made it complicated. You could have told me sooner. Before the wedding day." "I could have," he admitted. "I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. But some part of me was afraid that once you knew, you'd stop looking at me the way you did in those woods." He paused. "I was afraid of losing something I'd only just found." Alara thought about that for a long moment, turning the honesty of it over in her mind. "I understand fear like that," she said finally, "better than I'd like to." "I know," Kale said quietly. "It's one of the reasons I trust you with the truth now, even the parts that don't reflect well on me." She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her without hesitation, and for a while neither of them said anything else, content in the particular quiet that had become theirs. It wouldn't last, of course. Nothing that easy ever did. The letter arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, carried by a rider who'd pushed his horse hard enough to arrive lathered and shaking. Adenfell was flooding. Alara read the message twice before the words fully landed. Unseasonable rains, the river breaking its banks, half the lower village already underwater, her family's home among the first to flood given its proximity to the water. Her father, weakened already, had been pulled from rising water by neighbors. Her mother was safe but frantic. Wren had gone missing for 6 terrifying hours before being found sheltering in the mill with 2 younger children she'd refused to leave behind. "I need to go to them," Alara said, already moving toward the door before she'd finished the sentence. "You will," Kale said, already calling for his steward, already setting motion to a dozen things simultaneously: supplies, physicians, an escort large enough to make the 3-day journey safely and quickly. "I'm coming with you." "You can't. The council can manage a week without me for something like this," he said, and there was no room in his voice for argument. "Your village is drowning, Alara. I'm not sending relief from behind a desk while you go alone." She hadn't expected the offer, hadn't dared to. Kings, in her limited understanding of them, sent soldiers and supplies and letters of condolence. They didn't ride 3 days themselves into a flooded fishing village to stand in the mud beside people who had nothing to offer them. Kael did exactly that. He arrived in Adenfell not as the Alpha King in ceremonial armor, but in plain traveling clothes, sleeves rolled up within an hour of arrival, hauling sandbags alongside villagers who had no idea, initially, who he actually was. It was only when someone recognized the royal insignia on the escort's uniforms that a ripple of shock moved through the village, followed by a kind of stunned, grateful disbelief that their king, the man whose name they'd only ever spoken with fear, was standing waist-deep in floodwater beside them. "Your Majesty, you shouldn't be," one of the village elders started, mortified. "I've been in worse places than this," Kael said, hefting another sandbag. "Where do you need these?" Alara's father, weak but alive, watched his son-in-law work alongside neighbors and strangers with an expression that shifted slowly from disbelief to something like awe. "He's not what I expected," her father said quietly, watching Kael direct a group reinforcing the mill's foundation. "He's not what anyone expects," Alara said, and found herself smiling despite everything, despite the exhaustion, despite the fear that had gripped her chest since the letter arrived. They stayed 4 days, longer than Kael had originally planned, overseeing repairs, ensuring supplies actually reached the families who needed them most, rather than disappearing into administrative delay. By the time they left, the village that had once whispered about the Alpha King with dread had begun, cautiously, to speak of him differently. "You didn't have to do all that," Alara told him on the ride back, watching the exhaustion finally settle into his shoulders now that there was no one left to perform strength for. "I wanted to," he said simply. "This is your home. It matters because it matters to you." Sarah wouldn't have come, Alara said, not quite sure why she brought it up. "No," Kael agreed. She wouldn't have understood why it was necessary. It was during the ride home that the first real conversation about the future happened, not the immediate future of flood repairs and supply lines, but the larger, more permanent question of what came next. "I've been thinking about the pact," Kael said, "the one that brought you to me. I want to end it formally, not just for Adenfell, for every village bound by it. Can you do that?" "I can now," he said. The council resisted because they worried about destabilizing agreements built on it. But watching you these past months, watching what you've become at court despite everything working against you, I have leverage now I didn't have before. Proof it doesn't need to work the way it always has. Because of me? Because you've shown them a queen who cares about a flooded fishing village more than she cares about court politics, Kael said. That matters more than any argument I could have made alone. Alara felt something warm and fierce rise in her chest, gratitude tangled with a growing, undeniable love she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet, not out loud, not even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She should have known better than to feel settled. Somewhere back at court, Lady Sarah had been watching the king's absence with an entirely different kind of attention, and she had not spent those 4 days idle. Alara noticed the shift the moment they returned to court, a change in the air she couldn't immediately name, glances that lingered a half-second too long. Conversations that stopped, rather than paused when she entered a room. "Something's different," she told Kael that evening. "People are looking at me strangely." "Court gossip," he said, though his jaw had tightened in a way that suggested he already knew more than he was saying. "It'll pass." It didn't pass. If anything, it grew worse over the following days, whispers following her through corridors like a persistent draft she couldn't quite locate the source of. It was Kael's steward, Corwin, the real Corwin, kind-faced and apologetic in a way that suggested he hated being the one to deliver this, who finally told her the truth. "There's a rumor circulating," Corwin said carefully, "that you were already promised to someone in Adenfell before the marriage. That the king was deceived into this union. Alara felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. That's not true. There was no one. I believe you, Corwin said. But belief and proof are different currencies at court, and someone has been very effective at spreading the first while withholding the second. Sarah, Alara said, not a question. Corwin's silence was answer enough. The rumor gained weight over the following days in ways that frightened Alara more than she wanted to admit a supposed letter, never actually produced, but referenced constantly, describing a village sweetheart Alara had abandoned to marry the crown. A witness, unnamed, who claimed to have seen the two of them together before her departure for the capital. It's fabricated, Alara told Kale, desperate for him to believe her even though he'd never once questioned it aloud. There's no truth in any of it. I know, Kale said, and meant it, but the frustration in his voice was new, sharper than she'd heard from him before. Knowing and proving are different things, and Sarah has structured this carefully enough that direct denial only fuels it further. What do? We wait for her to overreach, Kyle said. People this careful eventually make a mistake. When she does, I'll be ready. But waiting felt unbearable, especially as the whispers grew teeth. A noblewoman Alara barely knew made a pointed comment during a court dinner about girls who abandoned village boys for crowns. Another suggested, with false sympathy, that surely the marriage could be annulled if the king had been genuinely misled. Alara found herself doubting things she shouldn't have doubted, not the truth of her own history, but whether Kyle patience would eventually wear thin under the pressure. Whether love this new could actually survive court politics this determined to destroy it. You've been distant, Kyle observed one evening, watching her more carefully than she'd realized. I'm scared, Alara admitted, the honesty costing her more than she expected. Not of the rumors being true. Of what happens if enough people believe them anyway. If the council decides the marriage was built on deception regardless of what actually happened. The council doesn't decide my marriage, Kyle said, gentler now, understanding the fear beneath her distance. I do. And nothing Sarah manufactures changes what I know to be true about you. But if it threatens the kingdom's stability, then I deal with the threat directly, he said. Not by doubting you. It should have reassured her completely. It nearly did. Until 3 nights later, when Alara was summoned unexpectedly to a private meeting room by a servant claiming urgent business regarding her family in Adenfell, a summons that turned out to be nothing of the sort. Lady Sarah was waiting alone when Alara arrived, composed and cold in a way that made the room feel colder too. I wanted to speak with you honestly, Sarah said, before this goes further than either of us would like. There's nothing honest about what you've been spreading, Alara said, refusing to let her voice shake. Perhaps not entirely, Sarah conceded, unbothered. But perception matters more than truth here, and you've been at court long enough now to understand that, surely, what do you want? I want you to leave, Sarah said simply. Quietly, return to Adenfell, claim you were homesick, whatever preserves your dignity best. In exchange, the rumors stop. Your family remains protected, the debt forgiveness remains honored. Everyone gets what they actually need. Except Kyle. Kyle needs a queen this court respects without effort, Sarah said. Not one he has to fight a war of rumors to protect indefinitely. I'm offering you an exit before it becomes something uglier. And if I refuse? Sarah's expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. Then I suppose we'll see how much of this the marriage can survive. Alara didn't tell Kyle about the meeting immediately. She told herself it was because she needed to think clearly first, without his fury complicating her judgment. But the truth was smaller and more frightening than that some part of her was afraid that if she repeated Sarah's threat out loud, it might start to feel possible in a way it currently didn't. That silence turned out to be a mistake. Sarah moved faster than Alara expected, and with far more precision than a simple rumor campaign. 3 days after their private meeting, Alara received an urgent message claiming Kale needed her in the East receiving room, immediately a summons that felt wrong the moment she read it, phrased strangely, missing the small personal touches Kale's actual messages always carried. She went anyway, because the alternative was not going and being wrong about that instinct. The East receiving room was empty when she arrived, except for a man she didn't recognize standing near the window, and Sarah positioned just inside the doorway like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "What is this?" Alara asked, already understanding, with sick clarity, that she'd walked into something constructed specifically for her arrival. "An unfortunate misunderstanding," Sarah said. "That's about to become considerably worse for you." The door opened again before Alara could respond, and Kyle stepped through it, summoned by a message that had clearly been engineered with the same careful cruelty as her own. His eyes moved from Alara to the unfamiliar man beside her, positioned deliberately close, and something in his expression shifted, hardened, a fury Alara had glimpsed only once before, during that council meeting she'd witnessed by accident months ago. "Explain this," Kale said, voice dangerously quiet. "There's nothing to explain," Alara said quickly. "I don't know this man. I received a message saying you needed me here, as did I," Kyle said. "Saying you needed me here, urgently, alone." His gaze moved to Sarah, understanding arriving with visible speed. "You arranged this." "I arranged an opportunity for the truth to reveal itself," Sarah said calmly. "What you both choose to believe about what you're seeing is entirely your own decision." "There's nothing to see," Alara said, desperation creeping into her voice now. "This is exactly what she wants you to think I know," Kyle said, and something in his tone made Alara's breath catch, because it wasn't doubt in his voice at all. It was fury, but not directed at her. He crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped the unfamiliar man by the collar, lifting him half off his feet with a strength that made the man's face go pale with genuine terror. "Who paid you?" Kyle said, voice dropping into something Alara had never heard directed at another person before, to stand in this room. "I, Your Majesty." "I didn't who?" Kyle repeated, and the man broke almost instantly, the truth spilling out in a frightened rush payment from Lady Sarah's household. Instructions to simply stand close to the Queen when summoned, nothing more explained, nothing more required. Kyle released him, and the man fled the room without looking back. "You fabricated this," Kyle said, turning to Sarah, and his voice had gone dangerously flat. "I created an opportunity," Sarah said, though for the first time her composure cracked slightly at the edges, sensing the ground shifting beneath her plan faster than she'd anticipated. "What you do with the truth of her origins, her deception before the marriage, that's entirely there was no deception," Kyle said. "Not from her. All of it. Every rumor, every whispered lie, it came from you." "You can't prove I don't need to prove anything," Kyle said. "I own this kingdom, Sarah. I decide what happens next, and right now what's happening is you leaving this court, permanently, before I decide your family's holdings deserve closer scrutiny than they've received in years." Sarah's face went white, the calculation behind her eyes shifting rapidly as she recognized, too late, that she'd overplayed a hand she'd believed unbeatable. "Your Majesty, surely you have 3 days to arrange your departure," Kyle said. "Use them wisely." Sarah left without another word, though the look she gave Alara on her way out carried a bitterness that made Alara's skin crawl even after the door closed behind her. Alone finally, Kyle turned to Alara, and the fury drained slowly from his face, replaced by something gentler, guiltier. "I should have believed you faster," he said. "The moment the rumors started, I should have shut them down entirely instead of waiting for proof." "You believed me," Alara said. "You just needed proof for everyone else. I needed proof for myself too, somewhere I wasn't proud of," he admitted. "For half a second in that doorway, before I understood what I was looking at, there was doubt. I hate that there was doubt." Alara crossed the room and took his hand, feeling the tension still coiled tight beneath his skin. "It was half a second," she said. "I can live with half a second, Kyle. What I couldn't live with was you believing it." "I never believed it," he said. Not really. I was afraid, and fear made the half-second longer than it should have been. The weeks following Sarah's departure brought a kind of quiet Alara hadn't experienced since arriving at court, not the anxious quiet of waiting for the next attack, but something closer to peace, tentative and unfamiliar enough that she kept expecting it to shatter. It didn't, not immediately. Instead, something else happened. Something that surprised her more than any court intrigue could have. The formal dissolution of the ancient pact went through the council with less resistance than Chaol had anticipated the flood in Adenfell, and the visible, undeniable evidence of the king wading through floodwater alongside his people had shifted public sentiment in ways that made the old system look exactly as outdated and unnecessary as it actually was. Villages across the border regions would no longer be required to offer daughters as a condition of protection. The debt that had brought Alara to the capital in the first place became simply forgiveness, unconditional, permanent. You did this, Alara told him, reading the formal decree with something close to disbelief. Because of Adenfell. Because of me. Because it was already wrong, Chaol said. You simply gave me the leverage to finally fix it. Her father's health improved slowly but steadily with proper physicians and consistent care, funded quietly by the crown in ways Kyle insisted were simply appropriate for family, not charity. Wren, given the chance at an education she'd never have accessed in Adenfell, began attending lessons at the capital, discovering an aptitude for mathematics that surprised everyone except, apparently, Alara, who'd always known her sister was sharper than the village had given her room to be. She could run an entire treasury someday, Chaol observed once, watching Wren work through figures with an ease that made her tutors visibly impressed. Don't tell her that, Alara said, laughing. She'll never stop reminding me she's smarter than both of us combined. It was during this quieter season that Alara finally allowed herself to fully believe in the life she'd stumbled into, not the version built on obligation and sacrifice. The arithmetic that had sent her toward the capital in the first place, but something chosen, wanted. Real in a way she hadn't expected marriage to a stranger could ever become. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, she admitted to Chaol one evening, the honesty slipping out before she'd fully decided to share it. This feels too settled, too easy, after everything. It won't always be easy, Chaol said. Kingdoms rarely stay quiet for long, and neither does court. But this he gestured between them, something soft in his expression. This part, I don't intend to let anything shake. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can promise I'll fight for it every time something tries. There was a particular evening, months into the settled quiet, when Chaol brought her somewhere unexpected, not the grand chambers she'd grown accustomed to, but a modest garden tucked behind the castle's older wing, overgrown in a way that suggested it had been forgotten by most of the court. This was my mother's, he said, walking her through paths half reclaimed by wildflowers. Before she died. I used to come here as a child, though I stopped once my father decided gardens were an indulgence unbecoming of an heir. It's beautiful, Alara said, meaning it, drawn to the unpretentious wildness of it in a way the castle's formal gardens had never managed. I want to restore it, Chaol said. Properly, not as a monument, just as a place that's ours. He paused, watching her reaction carefully. I want our children, if we're fortunate enough to have them, to grow up somewhere that isn't only formal ceremony and political calculation. The mention of children, spoken so plainly, so hopefully, made something warm settle deep in Alara's chest. You're thinking that far ahead already? I've been thinking about it since the flood, he admitted. Watching you with the children in that mill, the ones Wren refused to leave behind, I understood something about you in that moment I hadn't fully understood before. What? That you'll be a remarkable mother, he said simply, and that I very much want to see it. Alara reached for his hand among the overgrown flowers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content in a quiet that felt, finally, permanent rather than temporary, the kind of peace that didn't need defending, at least not today, not in this particular garden, with this particular man who'd once lied to her by a stream and spent every day since making up for it in ways she'd stopped counting. The announcement of Alara's pregnancy came nearly a year after the wedding, delivered first to Kael in the privacy of their chambers before any court physician made it official. "You're certain?" he asked, and Alara had never seen him look quite so carefully hopeful, like he was afraid to fully believe it before confirmation arrived. "The physician confirmed it this morning," she said. "I wanted to tell you myself before anyone else found out." Kael's reaction wasn't the composed, careful response of a king processing important news for succession purposes. It was raw, immediate. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms with a kind of desperate gentleness, like he was trying to hold something precious without accidentally crushing it. "Alara," he said, her name coming out rough, and she felt something wet against her shoulder that she was fairly certain wasn't hers. "Are you crying?" she asked, half laughing, entirely undone by the sight of it. "I don't cry," he said, clearly crying. Of course not. The pregnancy brought its own particular challenges. Court physicians who hovered with an intensity Alara found suffocating, her mother arriving from Adenfell to help despite the long journey being difficult for a woman still recovering from the flood's aftermath, and a summer heat that made the final months feel endless in a way nobody had adequately warned her about. But it also brought a kind of tenderness from Kael that surprised her constantly, despite months of learning exactly how gentle he could be beneath the fearsome reputation. He rearranged council meetings around her needs without being asked. He learned, with an almost scholarly dedication, which food settled her stomach and which made the nausea worse. He read to her in the evenings when sleep proved difficult, his voice low and steady, the same voice that had once made grown soldiers flinch, now used entirely for her comfort. "You don't have to do all this," she told him once, watching him carefully rearrange pillows for the fourth time that evening. "I want to," he said, exactly as he had during the flood. The same simple, unwavering certainty in his voice. "This matters because it matters to you." Ren, now settled into capital life with genuine enthusiasm, visited constantly during the final months, bringing an energy and irreverence that made the long, uncomfortable pregnancy feel more bearable. "You look enormous," Ren informed her cheerfully during one visit. "Thank you. That's exactly what every expectant mother wants to hear. I'm just being honest. You're the size of a small barn. I'm going to remember this when you're pregnant someday." "I'm never having children," Ren said with the absolute confidence of a 17-year-old who'd recently discovered mathematics offered a far more predictable future than family life. "I'm going to run a treasury and never sleep badly again." Alara laughed, the sound genuine and easy in a way that would have felt impossible during those first frightened weeks at court, back when every conversation felt like navigating unfamiliar terrain without a map. Her father, though frail, made the journey for the final month, determined to be present for the birth despite everyone's protests that the travel was too much for his health. He arrived thinner than Alara remembered, but with color in his cheeks that hadn't been there in years, evidence of proper care finally reaching a man who'd spent decades without it. "I never imagined this," he told her one evening, watching Kael across the room in careful conversation with a physician about the birth preparations. "The night you volunteered at that town hall meeting, I thought I was losing you to something terrible." "You almost did," Alara admitted, if Kael had been anyone else. "But he wasn't," her father said. "And you found each other anyway, underneath all the deception and politics. That has to mean something." "It means everything," Alara said, and found she meant it completely, without reservation, in a way the frightened girl standing in that town hall a year ago could never have predicted. The labor, when it finally came, was long and difficult in the particular way labors often are, but Kyle remained beside her throughout every hour of it, refusing the physician's suggestions that he wait elsewhere, holding her hand through pain that made her understand, finally, why women spoke of childbirth the way soldiers spoke of battle. When their daughter finally arrived, small and furious and undeniably alive, Kyle held her with a careful reverence that made Alara's exhausted heart ache with something too large for words. "She's perfect," he whispered, and Alara, watching the most feared man in the kingdom cradle their daughter like she was made of something more fragile than glass, thought that perhaps this was the truest version of him, not the weapon his father had raised him to be. But this. They named her Rowan, after Kael's mother, whose garden they'd finally restored together in the months leading up to the birth wildflowers cleared and cultivated, without losing the untamed spirit that had drawn Alara to it initially. Benches added where none had existed before. A small fountain Kael had commissioned specifically for the sound of running water, which he claimed reminded him of the stream where they'd first met. "You never told me that's why you wanted the fountain," Alara said, discovering the detail months after its installation, watching him with newfound understanding. "I didn't want to make it obvious," Kyle admitted, slightly sheepish in a way she found endlessly endearing on a man who ruled an entire kingdom with unquestioned authority. "It felt sentimental in a way I wasn't sure how to explain properly. You could have just told me. I'm still learning how to do that," he said, saying things plainly, without armor around them. "You've made it easier than I expected, but old habits take time." Rowan grew quickly in the way infants do, developing a temperament that seemed to combine her father's quiet intensity with her mother's stubborn determination in ways that already, at only a few months old, worried the court advisors about what kind of ruler she might eventually become. "She's going to be difficult," one advisor commented during a particularly loud display of infant displeasure over a delayed feeding. "Good," Kyle said, entirely unbothered. "This kingdom needs rulers who refuse to accept convenient answers." Adenfell flourished in ways it hadn't in decades. The debt forgiveness and consistent crown support transforming a village that had been slowly dying into one with genuine prospects for the first time in a generation. Alara visited regularly, bringing Rowan along as she grew old enough to travel, watching her daughter splash in the same river Alara had grown up fishing. Now clean and properly managed thanks to infrastructure improvements Kael had personally overseen. "This is where you're from," Alara told Rowan during one visit, though her daughter was far too young to understand the words, more interested in the texture of river stones than any explanation of heritage. "Never forget where you're from, even when you have everything else available to you." Her father lived long enough to watch Rowan take her first unsteady steps across the garden Alara and Kael had restored together, a milestone that brought tears to eyes that had grown accustomed to hardship rather than joy. "I never thought I'd see this," he told Alara quietly, watching his granddaughter stumble determinedly across grass that had once been overgrown wilderness, a future this good, for any of us. "You earned it," Alara said. "All those years, all that hardship. You earned something better eventually." The marriage itself, tested early by lies and rumors and a rival's careful manipulation, settled into something steady and unshakable in the years that followed, not without disagreements, not without the ordinary friction of two people building a life together, but grounded in an honesty that had been hard-won and was, both of them agreed, worth every difficult conversation it had required to reach. "Do you regret the woods?" Alara asked him once, years later, watching Rowan chase something through the garden that only made sense to a small child's imagination. "The lie you told me? Before any of this?" "I regret that it was necessary," Kyle said, exactly as he had the very first time she'd asked him this question, though his answer had deepened with years of certainty behind it now. "I don't regret meeting you. I don't regret any single moment since, even the ones that nearly broke us." "Even Sarah?" "Especially Sarah," he said, without her overreaching, I might never have understood how much I was willing to fight for what we'd built. Sometimes the worst moments clarify things gentler seasons never could. Alara considered that, watching her daughter's small, determined face as she attempted, unsuccessfully, to catch a butterfly that had no interest in being caught. I volunteered at that town hall meeting because I thought I was making a sacrifice, she said. Giving up my own future to save everyone else's. And now? Now I understand I wasn't giving anything up at all, she said. I was walking toward exactly the life I didn't know yet that I wanted. Kyle reached for her hand, and they stood together in the garden that had once belonged to a mother he barely remembered, and now belonged to a daughter who would grow up knowing exactly how loved she was. In a kingdom slowly learning that strength and gentleness were never actually opposites. Not when the person holding both understood how to balance them properly. Forced to marry a stranger, Alara said quietly, almost laughing at how far that description now felt from the truth. And instead, you found exactly the life you were always meant to have, Kale finished, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Content simply to watch their daughter grow up in a garden built from restored wilderness and hard-won honesty. Exactly as it should have been from the very beginning. Years passed with the particular gentleness of a life finally settled into its proper shape, and Alara found herself, more often than she expected, thinking back to that terrified girl who'd stood up in a village town hall and volunteered for a fate she'd assumed would be difficult at best, tragic at worst. Rowan grew into a child who asked endless questions, curious about everything from the mechanics of the castle's ancient plumbing to the political structure of the neighboring kingdoms. A curiosity Kael encouraged relentlessly, despite the exhaustion it occasionally produced in tutors unprepared for a princess who refused to accept incomplete answers. "Where do rivers go?" Rowan asked once, standing at the edge of the very fountain Kael had commissioned after they leave here. "To the sea, eventually," Alara told her. "Every river finds its way there in the end, even the ones that take strange, winding paths to get there. Did your river take a strange path?" Alara laughed, surprised by the accidental wisdom in a child's simple question. "The strangest path imaginable," she said. "But it led somewhere better than I ever expected." Adenfell continued to prosper, no longer a village defined by debt and hardship, but one known increasingly for the quality of its harvests and the resilience of its people, a transformation Alara watched with quiet pride during each visit home. Wren, true to her early ambitions, eventually took a position managing Crown Treasury matters, proving as sharp with numbers as everyone had always suspected, occasionally advising Kyle on matters far beyond what anyone would have predicted for a girl who'd once feared being chosen for the very marriage her sister ultimately volunteered for instead. "You saved me from a life I would have hated," Wren told Alara once, years into her treasury work. "I would have made a terrible queen consort. I'm a far better accountant." "You would have found your way regardless," Alara said. "I just gave you a different path to find it on." Sarah, in the years following her departure, faded from court gossip almost entirely, rumored to have settled in a distant province with family holdings far removed from the capital's political intrigue. Occasionally news of her reached the castle secondhand, mostly unremarkable, the fire that had once driven her careful schemes apparently redirected toward more ordinary pursuits. Alara found she didn't think of her often, the wound of those difficult weeks having healed into something more like a distant scar than an open injury. Kyle's rule strengthened over the years, tempered by the lessons of that first difficult year of marriage into something more thoughtful than the fear-driven authority he'd inherited from his father. The old pact system, fully dissolved, became a footnote in the kingdom's history rather than an ongoing injustice, occasionally referenced in lessons about outdated governance that new generations found difficult to believe had ever been standard practice. "You changed more than just our lives," Alara told him once, watching him work through council matters with a patience that had grown more natural over the years rather than performed. You changed how this entire kingdom treats the people it's supposed to protect. You changed how I understood what protection actually means, Kyle said. I used to think it meant strength alone. You taught me it means presence, too. Showing up, even when showing up is difficult. Their second child arrived 3 years after Rowan, a son they named Finn, quieter than his sister but with the same stubborn determination that seemed to run through both sides of the family, regardless of which parent's temperament he'd otherwise inherited. Life, in the years that followed, settled into the ordinary rhythms of a family navigating both the demands of ruling a kingdom and the simpler joys of watching children grow, occasionally interrupted by the political complications inherent to any position of power, but never again shaken by the particular betrayal that had nearly unraveled everything during that first difficult year. Do you ever miss it? Kyle asked once, years later. The simple life. Fishing nets and river water instead of council meetings and formal ceremony. Alara considered the question seriously, watching Rowan and Finn chase each other through the garden that had become, over the years, entirely their own rather than simply Kyle's mother's memory. I miss the simplicity sometimes, she admitted. But I don't miss the fear. The uncertainty of whether my family would survive another bad harvest, another sickness we couldn't afford to treat properly. She reached for his hand. This life is more complicated, certainly, but it's also safer, in ways that matter more than simplicity ever did. I'm glad, Kale said. I've spent every day since that stream trying to make sure you never regretted saying yes. I never have, Alara said. Not once. 10 years after that frightened girl had stood up in a village town hall and volunteered for a marriage she'd assumed would be nothing but sacrifice, Alara sat in the same garden where Kyle had first told her about his mother, watching their 2 children grow into people neither of them could have fully predicted, and understood, with quiet certainty, that the strange, winding path her river had taken had led exactly where it was always meant to. Rowan, 10 years old now, had developed an interest in governance that made the court advisors increasingly certain the kingdom's future was in capable hands, asking questions during council observations that occasionally embarrassed advisors twice her age with their sharpness. Finn, 7, showed less interest in politics and more in the mechanics of things, disassembling clocks and simple machines with a curiosity that Kale found endlessly amusing, given his own complete lack of patience for such precise, delicate work. He's going to take apart the entire castle eventually, Kale observed, watching Finn methodically dismantle a broken lantern with intense concentration. Better than setting it on fire, Alara said. Small mercies, the garden itself had grown into something neither entirely wild nor entirely cultivated, a balance Alara had insisted on maintaining despite the castle groundskeeper's occasional suggestions that more formal landscaping might suit a royal garden better. Your mother wouldn't have wanted formal, Alara told Kale once, when the suggestion came up again. She'd have wanted exactly this, something that feels alive rather than arranged. You never met her, Kyle pointed out, though gently, without real argument. I know her through you, Alara said. And through this garden. That's enough. Adenfell, when Alara visited now, bore little resemblance to the struggling village she'd left behind a decade earlier. New construction lined streets that had once been muddy and neglected. The Mill Wren had once sheltered children in during the flood, now serving a prosperous grain trade that extended well beyond the village's own needs. Her mother, older now but healthier than she'd been in years, had taken to helping manage the village's growing affairs, a role she approached with the same quiet determination she'd once brought to simply keeping her family fed through difficult seasons. You gave this village a future, her mother told her during one visit. Whatever else people say about political marriages and royal obligations, you gave us this. Kyle gave you this, Alara said. I only married him. You gave him reason to care enough to fix it properly, her mother countered. That matters more than you're willing to admit, Alara. It always has. Perhaps her mother was right. Alara had spent years deflecting credit for changes that had transformed not just Adenfell, but the entire system of border villages once bound by an unfair, outdated pact, uncomfortable with the idea that her presence alone had mattered as much as Kael's direct action. But watching Adenfell now, thriving in ways it never had during her childhood, she allowed herself, finally, to accept that perhaps both things were true simultaneously, that Kael's power had enabled the change, and her presence had provided the reason for him to use it. Kael found her later that evening, still sitting in the garden long after the children had been called inside for dinner, watching the last of the daylight fade over restored wildflowers that had once been forgotten and overgrown. "You're thinking too hard about something," he observed, settling beside her with the easy familiarity of 10 years of marriage. "Just remembering," she said, "that town hall meeting. How certain I was that I was sacrificing everything. And now? Now I understand I was walking toward everything instead," she said, echoing words she'd said years before, though they felt truer now, weighted with a decade of evidence rather than early hope. The village girl who thought she was giving up her future found something better than she ever could have imagined for herself. The stranger she was forced to marry, Kael said, turned out to be exactly what she needed all along. "He did," Alara agreed, leaning into him as the garden settled into evening quiet around them, their children's laughter drifting faintly from inside the castle, the entire complicated, difficult, ultimately beautiful decade stretching behind them like proof that even the most frightening beginnings could lead somewhere worth every difficult step it took to arrive.